And there we go. All right, so I want to welcome you to one of the spring webinars for PBIS in Maryland. And today we're going to be talking about Tier 1 and Tier 2 approaches, PBIS or MTSS approaches to support classroom management. And what we're going to end up doing today is I want to just orient you to some of the materials first before we get into some introductions. I'll give you a little bit of the background here. We're talking about PBIS Maryland, that historically has been that partnership between the state, Sheppard Pratt and Hopkins. And we're continuing to support PBIS in Maryland through Sheppard Pratt at this time as we all move forward with this work. But I want to acknowledge that the real foundation for this work is you all. It's the local school systems, it's the educators, it's the folks in the classroom, administrators, the instructional aides, the support staff, and I'm missing, a thousand different roles that are within schools, but it really is the foundation of PBIS in Maryland has and always has been at the local level. And so your continued dedication and work to implementing the framework of PBIS or utilizing the framework of PBIS or MTSS, whatever language you like to use in your system, is really important and shows the strong history and dedication to this work and using that framework to help organize your supports in your schools. The resources today, you will be able to find those on the PBIS Maryland website. And I'm going to drop the link that will take you directly to that section of the website. And so you can take a look at that. It's in the chat now. It'll take you directly to the PowerPoint presentation and the one resource guide that I have shared for today. Again, a reminder, the session is being recorded. It will be posted right where you can find these resources. When you go to that site, what you will find is the coaches meeting tab it's going to take you directly to the coaches meeting tab if you use the link. Oh, here we go. Let me just make sure I send it to everybody. Thank you. There we go. There's the link. So it'll take you directly to the resources today. If you scroll down on this page, you'll see a table that will include information about the PowerPoints and the one resource guide from the center. There are two PowerPoint versions. One is a full slide version of the PowerPoints, and then the other is a 3-slide handout of the PowerPoints. All right. So that's where all of the resources will be found for these meetings and all of the archived meetings. So I just want to start by doing some welcomes and introductions. introductions. I'm coming to you today from Sheppard Pratt and PBIS Maryland. My name is Jennifer Jeffrey Pearsall. I am the director of the PBIS Training and Technical Assistance Center at Sheppard Pratt and have been supporting PBIS in Maryland with the school systems and our, a developmental disabilities administration that supports adults throughout our state as well. And so I wanted to take a moment to get to know who we have here today. And if you could please in chat, share your name, the school and or system that you're joining us from, what your role is, and then maybe one thing that has recently brought you joy. All right. And I will do the same thing here. So when you have a second, you can put that into chat. All right, thanks, Elizabeth. I will share my joy. Also, Wakamiko, thank you. Excellent. My kids bring me joy. Excellent. I see that. Student advisor. being in nature with my family. I was going to say, you'll see mine in a second. All right. Eating lunch outside brought me joy yesterday. The warm weather. Yep. Somebody passing a driver's test, or somebody in their family passing driver's test. Oh, your younger son passing his driver's test. Great. Excellent. Perfect. And then Crystal. All right. Discovering all the things, seeing my puppies discover all the things in nature and bringing you gifts, maybe, right? Excellent. My garden. Thanks, Patricia. All right. Excellent. Warm weather is bringing you joy. Yeah. Which leads to gardening and animals going outside and finding all those wonderful things outside, right? And exploring. So I think it's helpful sometimes to think about what brings us joy, even those small things, right? It doesn't have to be all the big things. An Aussie poo puppy, that probably the combination sounds like one of the cutest combinations I've heard of. So that's great. Perfect. Your grandchildren, yes, the people in our lives. Phone call from your son. That's very sweet. Excellent. Well, good. I'm glad that we can start today thinking about things that bring us joy. So keep those coming in. And hello, Christina, another Sheppard Pratt person in here. It's a couple of students who could not learn how to read and reading on their own. That's excellent. Those are big joys, right? Big impacts that you all have on the lives of others in the lives of others. So thank you. If I missed you, I'm sorry. I love active chats. They go fast and I can't catch everybody. So I tried to catch as many as I could, but hopefully you can see who all is here and had a moment to just think about the good stuff, right? So what I want to talk to you today about is, we're here to talk about Tier 1 and Tier 2 applications of MTSS or PBIS in the classroom. So we're going to just talk briefly about classroom systems in relation to MTSS. And then we'll review some strategies in relation to Tier 1 and Tier 2 implementation in the classroom. And it's really the intention to kind of get you thinking about how all of these systems work together and perhaps kind of the smaller progressions of intervention that can occur in the classroom to maintain kids in the classroom. And likely a lot of this is already what you are doing as a classroom teacher or your classroom teachers are doing if you're coaching teachers or if you're in a kind of a supportive role. And then I want to end with just doing like a scenario, a practice scenario of an example to get you all thinking as a kind of community on here in the webinar of how you might problem solve suggestions that you might have for that scenario. All right. As we go along, if there are questions, feel free to put them in the chat. If I am,
I just needed to turn down the volume. Yeah, no, it's fine.
Feel free to unmute and indicate that you said something that you or wrote something that you'd like me to attend to. I am fine with that. All right. We don't have a huge group today, so we can unmute if we need to. Give me a little nudge here and there. All right. I'm going to be talking about some terms here. And so I will say things like MTSS or PBIS. I will also be saying things, for school-wide positive behavioral interventions and support. And so when and we'll talk a little bit about MTSS and PBIS in a minute and give that explanation, but there will be terms that I use. And so when you see SEB, I'm talking about social, emotional, and behavioral skills in students. The mental health should have an H next to it, not an M. So that's an error on my part, but mental health. So these are some of the terms that you'll see in some of the slides. There are some other terms I didn't put in here, like opportunities to respond, but I will spell those out and make sure that we are knowing what those terms are. But for the big ones, when I say MTSS, it's multi-tiered system of supports. When I say PBIS, it's positive behavioral intervention and supports. And sometimes we put the school-wide in front of that as well. And a lot of what we do is the content today is really going to focus on those tier 1 and tier 2 strategies, or that kind of continuum of those strategies for social, emotional, and behavioral skill development with students in classrooms. So not focusing on literacy development or other academic skills, but the social, emotional, behavioral side. All right, so when we talk about MTSS in the classroom, I think it's important to understand the terms PBIS and MTSS. You know, we typically, we have used the term PBIS, it preceded the term MTSS. It shares the same features. PBIS is a data-informed framework for how we organize a continuum of supports for our students in relation to specifically behavioral, social, behavioral, emotional, mental health, skill development, the development of those skills, the prevention of challenges when it comes to social, emotional, and behavioral concerns. And in the term MTSS has evolved over years as an umbrella term to allow us to merge the academic RTI, or response to intervention, which again is that multi-tiered approach to how we use data to organize our curriculum and instruction and intervention approaches to support the academic development of students. And so MTSS tends to be that overarching term, but it is also used interchangeably. So we could talk about kind of the social, emotional, behavioral framework within our building following an MTSS, or a multi-tiered system of support, which is equivalent to a PBIS. All right, so if you hear those terms interchangeably, it's okay. And if you use them interchangeably with your system, that is okay too. Some systems define MTSS as that broader umbrella of pure alignment of all social, emotional, and behavioral interventions, as well as academic interventions. But the big thing to remember here is we're approaching, or I'm approaching this content today through that lens of a tiered system of support, whether you want to use the term PBIS or MTSS, where we're really thinking about what is that data-informed framework, things like screening, progress monitoring, for us to be able to put in place a continuum of supports that are evidence-based and informed based on science, you know, effective strategies, effective classroom management strategies, and ways to interact with students to promote success. Again, it's data-informed. And, you know, and should include shared leadership when we talk about school-wide elements of this. I'm going to be talking about class-wide today, and not kind of getting into the whole school-wide organization elements, but that's what we're talking about when we talk about MTSS or PBIS. Now, this is a session on classroom systems and MTSS within a classroom system. And so when we look at MTSS or PBIS, whatever the term you want to use for your school-wide approach to how you organize supports for students behaviorally and academically, there are multiple systems within systems, right? So within your school, you have your school-wide system, but you also have non-classroom settings. You have classroom settings. You have individual student characteristics and family characteristics that kind of comprise your environment. And each of these systems or settings, if you will, have their own unique characteristics, right? So classrooms are where students spend most of their time. These tend to be more structured than other settings within the school. Our non-classroom settings like cafeterias, hallways, parking lots, playgrounds are less structured times, right? And so they have their own characteristics and routines and procedures that guide how we can help shape our planning. But we're going to focus on classrooms today. So classrooms are a system within a system. And then within that classroom system, and don't feel like you need to read this, it's in that document that's on the website, or that's on PBIS Maryland. It's also at the end of the slide deck. But within the classroom, there's also this multi-tiered system of support, right? So you have a continuum of student need within each classroom. And it's figuring out how you use data to inform how you move your interventions around so that they're matched to student need, right? Sometimes we need to move students around, so they're matched to different, targeted group interventions. And we do this quite fluently on the academic side with our screening data, benchmark data, et cetera, to be able to identify pockets of academic need for kids and then match them quickly with Tier 2 supports. And it could be small group instruction in addition to the core curriculum and instruction that they're receiving. And so students should always receive those Tier 1 supports, that core curriculum, if you will, on the social, emotional, behavioral side and the academic side. And when they start to show some additional signs of needing support, then that's when we think about what do we need to layer on here. So it's really a layering effect of how we think about our interventions and how we match those interventions to students. And so that's what we're going to talk about today when it comes to thinking through those elements of Tier 1 and Tier 2 kind of progression of supports for students. And then the final element when it comes to an MTSS or PBIS is I want to center us around our core elements of how we make decisions. And so I will often refer to this as kind of the gears of the grandfather clock. What we see in the front, of a grandfather clock is our triangle. That's usually what we think about when we think about a multi-tiered system of support or PBIS. But what makes that continuum of support work well and how we identify practices and how we identify students that need to be linked with certain interventions and strategies and how we monitor our success really comes down to these core elements of making sure that we're focused on valued outcomes and then using data to identify where we need to grow, where students have the need, matching the practices to those students based on the data we're collecting, making sure that we have the systems in place to support how those interventions and strategies are put into place. So are there ways that we need to be supporting classroom teachers differently as they are incorporating more Tier 2 interventions into their classroom to support the dynamic need of students in their classroom? And all of which should be centered around equity. Every decision we make, every intervention we consider, every piece of data that we look at should be looked through the lens of making sure that we are taking an equity-centered focus in how data are collected, what data look like in a disaggregated format, thinking about practices that are culturally respectful and responsive to students, as well as systems that support all students. All right. So let's get into, before I move on, I just want to ask if there are any questions about just the general framework of MTSS or PBIS before we get into our applying this MTSS logic in the classroom. All right, if anything comes up, just feel free to chat away. And if you have some aha moments, or if you think, I've used this strategy and it's been successful, share that as well, so others can see how this is working within your system, or they can write down your name and try to connect with you outside of this as well to pick your brain on what's worked in relation to some of the content that we're about to cover. So I gave you the overview, the thumbnail sketch of MTSS PBIS, but let's get into when we think about, and this is the resource guide that is in, that is posted online, and a few folks have joined since we started. So I'm going to post the link for the materials here and make sure that we have all of that. There is a guide that from the Center for PBIS that I am following in these slides, if you will. So you can also take a look through that guide and pull it down. But what I want to be talking about here are some of the critical components to supporting social, emotional, and behavioral development in the classroom. And I'm going to talk through interventions and strategies through these buckets, right? There's that prevent bucket. What are strategies that we can do to prevent social, emotional, behavioral challenges by setting students up for success. There's an element of teaching, right? How do we teach crucial social, emotional, and behavioral skills? And then how do we respond, right? Responding in ways that encourage those skills to develop, as well as responding in ways that decrease those challenging social, emotional, behavioral challenges or unexpected behaviors in that situation. So we have kind of a two-pronged approach to responding. And what you might notice here for those, probably for everybody here, is this follows very closely in like an antecedent behavior consequence sequence. You know, so what are the things that we can do in the environment that set the stage for success? What are those prevention or antecedent strategies? What are the things that we can do in our environment to make sure that we are actively teaching the behaviors that will help students be successful? That's that behavior or teaching component. And then there's the responding, which is the consequence sequence, when we think about how do we set up those consequences or responses that are reinforcing of the skills that will promote success for students, and how do we respond to behaviors that are more challenging in real instructional ways that are restorative in nature as well. So you can think about this as a look at that ABC approach. If anybody has been involved with some of the Tier 3 planning from Glenn Dunlop and others, it's very similar to the prevent, teach, reinforce model for functional behavioral assessment and behavior intervention planning. Again, kind of carrying that theme across tiers, right? Even at Tier 1, we want to be thinking about the prevention aspect, the teaching aspect, and the responding aspect. And then we need to modify that as we move up tiers. But that's the whole thing that we do across all tiers, is think about how do we set kids up for success? What are we teaching? And how do we respond to encourage success and discourage the errors in behavior, if you will, like we do with academics. And it's all couched within this defined process of how do we use data and how do we collect information to determine whether we need to maintain what we're doing to continue to promote success, or if we need to adjust support based on those data. Do we need to do more? Do we need to add layers along this continuum? Or do we need, or now that we've added layers, are the data indicating that we can now fade those supports to see if the student is successful with our Tier 1 or universal approach? So, and I just talked through that data, but the data is a critical element as we talk through these practices of how we identify students as even at the lowest level of, you know, when we think about the continuum of supports, it's not just a step from Tier 1 to Tier 2 to Tier 3, it's a layering, right? And so we might have students that are somewhat successful with Tier 1 supports, but just need a little bit more, maybe not quite Tier 2, but a little bit more. So how do we address that continuum? What are some of those data that we can pull in the classroom as teachers that would help us see how students are being successful? So if you can take a moment in chat to think about those data sources, some of those quick and easy data sources that teachers can use to be able to start identifying student need at a low level, throw those in the chat, right? I'll put one in here. Even something as simple as a Post-it note with tally marks of calling out for a student, a behavior log. Thank you, Maria. And share, if you will, like some people have a minor incident report, some people have classroom logs. Share what you might have in your schools for collecting quick data on students, or efficiently collecting data on students, is around the social, emotional, and behavioral skills that could really help. Behavior charts, check-in, check-outs. Yep. Minor incident reports. Yep. MERS or minor incident reports. Yep. Yeah. So collecting those data. Yep. Absenteeism, Panther paws. Yep. Record of contacts home to parents. Yeah. So there are behavioral referrals and check-in, check-out. So there's what you're sharing are kind of a range of ways that teachers can collect data to keep their fingers on the pulse of how students are engaging social, emotional, and behaviorally in class. And sometimes grades are part of that too, right? If you have students that are not performing well behaviorally, it often impacts their grades as well. Thanks. So I'm going to talk us through those buckets of prevent, teach, and respond, and touch on define as well. But when we think about what prevention in the classroom looks like, I want to live in the Tier 1 world for a little bit. And those evidence-based approaches of prevention, those antecedent strategies to set students up for success, really fall within some core elements of making sure that your space is effectively laid out, that we're talking about developing and teaching routines, connecting with students, defining expectations and norms for the classroom, that prompting those behaviors, that you've defined, making sure that there's active supervision and engaging in effective instruction. Those are all known strategies, right? Those are best practice classroom management strategies for the prevention aspect of making sure we're setting students up for success. And it might look like at Tier 1, at the primary Tier 1 level, universal supports of making sure that the room layouts facilitates different instructional activities like small group instruction, independent work, if it's, in a lab, that you have the lab set up so that that students are able to really access all of the materials in the labs, or the supplies that are necessary, et cetera. It could be that you have some visual prompts in the classroom, as well as labels, bins that are labeled, according to if it's homework or if it's a reading bin for independent reading time for small group instruction in elementary school. You're making sure that you're teaching those routines of how do we turn in homework? When is that done? How is that done? What does it look like to engage in group work versus independent work? How do we use our voice throughout the class? Activities that you plan in advance of this, the beginning of the school year, of how to get to know each student and family, could be that you ask students some information about themselves in a worksheet format, if you will, and ask families as well. But then that ongoing connection within the classroom around greetings at the door, cooperative work. So those are some typical Tier 1 strategies. And so thinking about what might look, the differentiated support might look like, is another avenue of that continuum. So how can we kind of maybe take this to a 1.5 level and not a 2? And Kathleen, I see your hand up, so go for it and unmute and ask your question.
Okay.
Or
so I'm
comment.
Just trying to envision how this might look in high school. Just trying to think about that a little bit.
Sure thing. So in high schools, you still have those expectations, right? You still would have the classroom expectations, and you would still want to make sure that your routines are well identified, and making sure that you have those structures in place. In high school, you still need to teach the routine around submitting assignments. You still need to teach those routines around that are, also class specific. So, the routines in an ELA-based classroom would look a lot different than, if you're in a culinary arts program in one of your schools, or if you're in a science lab. So those routines are really important to define. And making sure that your expectations are linked, if you are in a school with a school-wide system and school-wide language, that the language that you're using in that classroom is linked to the school-wide language. So you're using the same 3 to 5 general expectations, but with your students, you might define that differently for what it looks like. And, and again, you can do greetings at the door is a really effective strategy at any grade level. You just need to contextualize it, right? And so we're not going to do the same kind of greetings at the door that we do in elementary school, perhaps, as far as the way we interact or some of the ways that we interact with kids, whether it's, fist pumps or little dances when you get in, open the door, but you still want to greet kids as they get in the door, set them up for what the routine is, and have some kind of entering situation. Yeah, in high schools, I always think about how a student can get help, what work is due when, and what they do. Those are some great routines too for high school as well. So Elizabeth, yes, I see your hand up. Do you want to share?
Yes, at our high school, it's really nice. Not only do teachers greet the students, but if they're like in wrestling or football, they comment on, that was a great game and you did really well. And as far as putting the schedule on the board, I know like the English teachers will put like daily warm up and then, vocabulary, then short essay, then reading, like they put their schedules still on the board. And I believe that helps the students a lot.
Yeah, I agree. And sometimes you'll see like it's a wall of schedules, right? Where you have the schedule for each class that they have. And it's just, each class knows that they look at this column, whether it's period 1, 3, or 4. So, good. Thank you for those suggestions. Some ways that it might look different are things like again, differentiating. We're not necessarily at a tier 2 level for students, but we might find that we need to have some kind of quiet space or calming corner as we're helping students with some self-regulation. We could be thinking about pairing pictures with text. And again, that could be developmentally appropriate for younger kids, but it also could be appropriate depending on the needs of the students as they get older as well. Making sure that we're, if we're seeing that students are having some trouble, a little bit of trouble with some of the typical routines, we might need to break those common routines down into smaller steps. And then also making sure that, if there are students that need more support in that area, we could also kind of picture sequence the routine, again, based on age or based on student need, regardless of age, as well as differentiating the context and the content of the greeting at the door. Again, greetings at the door is a really effective tier 1 strategy to help build connections and get students started for success as they walk into the classroom. The way it looks and needs to be contextualized based on the age of the students or the student need. This is just some information about the greetings at the door. The links are in the slides. You should be able to link to them if you are taking the slides down from the website, and they will take you where you need to go.
The dry.
There's a video in there about greetings at the door. It is more elementary based. But the handout that is there provides more structure for that. So again, a nice tier 1 strategy for greeting for that prevention aspect. But I want to talk about too now what it might look like at tier 2 in the classroom. And so what you'll see is that on the left-hand side, the prevention elements differ slightly, right? It's talking about increasing structure in the classroom, making sure that we're reteaching routines and procedures, increasing that connection, making sure there are targeted prompts and supervision, not just general active supervision, and then implementing some targeted antecedent manipulations or some specific things that we can do in the environment to prompt that success in a more strategic way. And they're broken down into 2 elements. If you go to the resource guide, what you'll see is that they also include check-in, check-out here. And I did not include check-in, check-out here because I think we can have that check-in, check-out conversation at a different time and at different days. But what we're talking about here are things that are related to what can be done in the classroom. So thinking about having different seating arrangements, making sure that if you're trying to target some opportunities for connection, there might be some opportunities to eat lunch with students, or to have more of a one-on-one walk to a different setting in the school. Thinking about how we can increase opportunities for choice, those antecedent strategies that are really helpful, adjusting those difficult tasks. And again, those being some of those tier 2 practices in the classroom that can, naturally occur in the classroom as you start to layer supports for students. They can become part of a more structured tier 2 plan as well with students. We also think too about social skills instruction, because a lot of times what we end up doing at tier 2 is thinking about how do we help develop additional skill sets for with these kids. And so it might look like, additional social skills instruction. The students are in a group, but what is it that we can do in the classroom to help support those skills to generalize that might be taught outside of the classroom? So if skills are taught outside of the classroom, that's one thing. But then the other thing that could happen is if you are engaged with social emotional learning or curriculum in your school, and there are either teachers that can do this, during differentiated instruction, or support staff that can come in. The first one is really primarily for more of our elementary groups, but thinking about tables in the classroom where social skills, more targeted social skills, could be reviewed and supported. And then making sure that we're teaching those routines for if a student is out of the classroom receiving instruction, how do they re-enter the classroom? Making sure that we're able to provide some prompts in our environment for those skills that are being taught, so that it's, students can typically practice those skills in like a counseling session or a small group session. But how do we encourage those behaviors from that prompting or that prevention lens to make sure that the students are using those behaviors? Right. So let's talk through a bit about teaching. And when we think about teaching, again, it's that bucket of explicitly teaching the behaviors. And when at tier 1, this looks like your class-wide expectations are linked and aligned with school-wide expectations, but are defined for the classroom context, making sure that you're identifying those routines and procedures, getting student voice along the way to make sure that they have input on what does it look like to be respectful in our classroom. Making sure that we're providing multiple opportunities to respond, and making sure that we are, again, that's OTR's opportunity to respond when it comes to providing those teaching opportunities, but over also just general classroom strategies for academic engagement, teaching and modeling those expectations, and then explicitly teaching certain social, emotional, and behavioral expectations, not just compliance, right? Some problem solving skills. How do you ask for help? I think, Patricia, you talked about in high school, thinking about, how students can ask for help when they need that support, and not necessarily social, emotional, behavioral regulation types of support. They can ask for that as well, but also just academic support. What are ways that we ask for help in our classroom? And I love this idea of what do you do after an absence? I think those are fantastic things to add into routines for students as we get into 5th through 12th grade, as students become more independent in making up work after they've been absent. So thinking about those natural routines in the classroom, as we increase a little bit, right, we're going into more not quite tier 2, but we're differentiating this a little bit. It's thinking about the range of social, emotional, behavioral skills when defining what those expectations look like in the classroom. And it might be that, after the first quarter, you have to review those expectations and norms that you developed as a classroom, because you're seeing patterns and behaviors that are not addressed. And so you need to, redefine what that looks like to address some of the concerns that you're having in the classroom. Again, providing those visual prompts and checklists for students, making sure that you're increasing your active supervision and interactions, providing additional prompts. Sometimes this can include pre-teaching those opportunities to respond, so that students have the opportunity to get answers correct, and start building that behavioral momentum of success so that they can actively engage in the classroom. Providing some extra practice on norms as well can be very helpful. All right. When we think about the teaching element, I borrowed this slide from Terry Scott, who is brilliant when it comes to classroom systems. And we think about what science tells us. And, we know that explicit instruction with repetition provides a better opportunity for us to have kind of that long-term storage memory. This is academics or social, emotional, and behavioral skills. And so we understand that, if we are not really explicit and we don't provide a lot of repetition for the skills that we're teaching around social, emotional, and behavioral skills, that it's not necessarily going to stick. And it's when we have students that have some challenges with learning, they, again, are going to need more of that repetition with these skills, more teaching, more modeling, more prompting in order to build the fluency with the skills that we're expecting them to demonstrate. When we think about Tier 2 and teaching, I want to just highlight a few of these elements that could illustrate those Tier 2 strategies, right? So thinking about reteaching and practicing those Tier 1 social, emotional, and behavioral skills, making sure to deliver lessons perhaps in small groups based on specific skills that you're not seeing in the classroom or you're not seeing enough of. And a lot of this at Tier 2 also comes down to dosage. It's not necessarily reinventing the wheel and bringing in a lot of external types of interventions, but what can we use from Tier 1 and increase how we use it? So making sure that there are multiple role plays and opportunities to practice. And again, this can occur with teachers in the classroom and in short sessions throughout multiple days. This could also be what support staff engage with students around to make sure that, but again, it's linked to thinking about what are those class-wide expectations? How do the skills, right? And I'm going over here to the social skills instruction. How are those social, emotional, behavioral skills that I'm learning perhaps in a small group setting are linked to the class-wide expectations and norms? So making those explicit connections. And then in classrooms, making sure that you're really encouraging the use of those new skills, all right? So those are ways that we can think about what Tier 2 might look like in classroom settings, and especially how we connect some of those potentially external supports that students are getting for social emotional instruction back into the classroom. When it comes to responding, we think about how do we, again, 2 prongs, how do we reinforce and build up the skills we want to see? And then how do we respond to behaviors that are unexpected, that are interfering with academic success or social and emotional success in school and in life? And so praise, right? But very specific verbal praise or behavior specific praise is a common Tier 1 strategy. When we think about making sure that we are also from an equity lens, identifying what preferred praise and acknowledgement looks like for students in the classroom. So it can be really important to to assess that, to ask questions around how do you like to be praised, and I'm thinking about the high school question as well of what behavior specific praise looks like, or verbal praise looks like, or acknowledgement looks like. And it's not just specific to high school, but it's specific to all kids. But, as kids get older, when kids are much younger, they, the verbal public praise can be really reinforcing. And at times it becomes less reinforcing and less developmentally appropriate too as students get older. So really understanding their praise preference. If students like verbal praise and getting to know that, if they don't, that's good to know. And why not just ask them early on in the process as you're getting to know the students what their preferences are. And so you can still praise students if they don't like that public verbal praise. You can do it privately. You can write notes of praise to students. You can come up with your own agreement of this is, if I do this, I am praising you. It could be a hand signal or a gesture. Thinking about ways that we also then want to, and I want to mention too, when we talk about praise to correction, because I'm going to mention correction as being supportive and instructional and restorative, than, more punitive in nature. We want to make sure that when we are correcting behaviors, that we also have a really dense environment of praise and acknowledgement. And it often is referred to as a bank. My colleague has talked about it like a bank. And, if we are always going to have to make that withdrawal in our classrooms and with students, we're always going to potentially have to correct something a student is doing to get them on the right track and kind of guide them that way. So you never want to withdraw your bank account to the point of a deficit, right? So we want to make sure we're putting in as much acknowledgement and praise into that environment. So when we do need to make a withdrawal, we're not going into a deficit. And, when it comes to our relationships, we want to have a really high level of positives in our bank, so that when we do have to engage in a correction or a complicated conversation, that there's that support in place. The other thing I wanted to talk about here is just the differentiation, thinking about different ways that we can differentiate Tier 1, kind of thinking about group contingencies or token economies, being more specific, having reflection sheets, etc. Right. All right. I will post this. I didn't get to post this yet, but there's a resource from Terry Scott around reinforcement that could be helpful if you're experiencing any challenges with the recognition process. And this is around behavior specific praise, acknowledging student success for social, emotional, behavioral skills, and provides some really nice links with the learning process and how we use acknowledgement and recognition in the academic world, or when it comes to academic skills versus social, emotional, and behavioral skills. And I'll load that in there too for you. I want to just talk about responding to, and I mentioned that when it comes to Tier 2, it's thinking about different ways that we can kind of adjust our acknowledgements, making sure that we might need to adjust how we're providing those acknowledgements, making those more dense, more frequent for the behaviors that you want to see to pay off. But then also from the social skills perspective too, of making sure that we're acknowledging the use of those skills across different settings, and making sure that we're acknowledging students supporting and going through that process of learning those new skills. I'm going to touch on the decision-making process real quick, but I want to get us into a activity for a few minutes before we leave. All right. When it comes to deciding, this is your database decision-making process. Like, how can you collect fidelity of what you're doing in the classroom? And it could be that you do a self-assessment of your own praise statements to correction statements, or you take 15 to 20 minute period of time and you count the opportunities to respond that you provide to students. Again, thinking about how you can efficiently self-monitor the way that you are engaging with students can be really helpful. And then considering some other outcome data, like thinking about like if you're looking at your minor referrals or other sources of data that you might be looking at for your behavior logs, I think came up in here as well, if there are any differences in those data. And then thinking to yourself too, if your fidelity data are lower than you expected, you want to be setting goals. You want to be making sure that you're adjusting what you're doing based on those data. And this falls through for Tier 2 as well. But at Tier 2, you want to be able to make sure that you're really monitoring the fidelity of each strategy that you're using, as well as monitoring the progress of students. So it just increases in intensity as far as what are collected. But it always should include fidelity data and outcome data. And a big idea here at Tier 2 is how do we transition students to more self-management strategies? All right, this is a kind of a thumbnail sketch of what we went through for Prevent, Teach, and Respond. It is in full display in that resource guide that I shared on the PBIS Maryland website with these materials. But I want to take the last few minutes just to do a little practice here. And we can do this in chat, and you can also unmute, but let's try this in chat a little bit. I'm going to give you a scenario of Mr. Patel, who teaches 6th grade science in one of his classrooms. That one of the classes he teaches is an advanced section where students receive grade level content, but the activities and assignments are structured to produce greater student independence and student initiated exploration. Mr. Patel, so students work more independently in this class through assignments. Mr. Patel has been collecting data on 2 students in the class who appear to be able to complete the work well when they complete the work. All right. He's tracked the number of reminders he provides these students during class, for example, redirecting them to get back to the in-class assignment, as well as when they complete assignments. Each of these students are rather social in class and often do not complete in-class work during the allotted time. His data show only 40% of assignments are completed and submitted during class, and are often submitting homework assignments late. His data show 80% of the assignments are submitted late. He has shared these data during his department meetings, and his team is brainstorming. These assignments tend to include multiple steps, and all of these steps are presented at once to students. He's noticed that when he chunks the assignments, each of these students are more successful at completing the assignment in time. So I want you to think about Prevent, Teach, and Respond. And as you think through that scenario, type in chat whether it's Prevent, Teach, or Respond strategy that you might suggest are implemented or incorporated into the classroom to support these students. All right, Maria, thank you. Prevent. And yeah, think about what might you suggest as a prevention strategy, or a teach strategy, or a respond strategy?
Are we allowed to unmute and share?
You can unmute, yes.
Well, maybe like giving some kind of incentive, like if your group completes this much of the assignment, you earn 5 extra points, or, you know,
Yeah,
something like that.
yeah. So like increasing that reinforcer, right? Increasing the reinforcer on the response end. Perfect. Other ideas, what might you do to help support these students in being successful?
One strategy that the lead teacher at my previous school used was whenever there was a certain amount of work that needed done in a certain amount of time, he would come to that student and say, okay, we have 20 minutes to complete this. How far do you believe you can get in the next 5 minutes? And then have the student mark that spot on the page. You come back and check in. Okay, now you're here. How far do you think you can get in the next 5 minutes? And that way the student is learning. So it's a way of teaching, and it's also a way of preventing them from being overwhelmed. It's chunking, but it's giving the student the power for that.
Yeah, so like self-guided chunking and
Yes.
what you're talking about there too leads to one of the strategies that we look at for tier 2 when it comes to thinking about the process of self-monitoring, right? How are we helping to build skills that we can then fade our support so students can self-monitor and do this on their own, right? There are a lot of prevents in here, visual reminders of the expectations, thinking about goalposts and checkpoints for each step, chunking along the way. We had heard about a reinforcement strategy of goal setting. And if you can get this much done in this amount of time, then you can get this reinforcer, this reward. Great. Yeah, teach what does success look like for each step. Yep, great. What other thoughts do you have around how these strategies, how you could layer strategies in this classroom to help support success here? You've come up with a lot of ideas, and I appreciate the use of chat and also unmuting. I love having the voices heard too, as well as the chat.
I'm just thinking about, this is 6th grade, but I'm thinking about older students too. I got older students on my mind today. So like, for example, I know in college that there are just some classes you have to kind of have peer support. You kind of have to be teaching each other. And is this a strategy that students could be learning a little bit when they're younger? Like, for example, this 6th grade, could they be paired with some other students who could maybe reteach as well, but that they're also developing that skill of being able to have to work with their peers and learn from their peers too. I don't know. It's just a thought I had.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea of pairing peers to be able to support each other. And that also, it helps build that skill, that these students need to have and how to pace themselves and chunk their work and hit goals, et cetera. But it also touches on that connections aspect too. If we can get students working with students, we're layering the different kinds of connections that students are building within the classroom. So yeah, that's great. All right, talking about real conversations about the trends in work completion. Yes, having those conversations and maybe linking it to, why is it important? What are these, these are foundation skills for, some of the more important things in your life, right? Or like perceived more important things in your life. Yep. Great, thank you. Thank you for engaging in that. I'm gonna just go through in our last minute and share a few resources here. We have this is linked on our on the website in the resources that I provided, but I'll also provide the link here directly to our TA center. And then we there we go. There's also this easy resource for high leverage practices in special education. I don't have a link to this. This is a book, but I'm sure you all are familiar. I just wanted to give recognition and a nod to high leverage practices and special education resources that are out there. I'm going to leave questions for when I am done going through this. If anybody wants to stay on, I'm happy to stay on if there are any questions. If you want to contact us at all, feel free to contact us at info@PBIS Maryland. And but I will hang for some questions as well. We have some upcoming webinars. You can access the registration there in our website. And then I also want to say, if you are a school, a PBIS school, then we have the recognition coming up, but check with your local district coordinator on times that things are due. And then finally, I have an evaluation that if you could take a few minutes to complete, it would be much appreciated. Your feedback is very much appreciated. It's in the chat. And I will leave it there for you to pull down and complete. If you would do so, that would be fantastic. I want to thank you for your time. I am going to circle back to the question slide and stay on here. If anybody has questions, just let me know. The recording will be available in the recording session. The recordings will be available where the materials are found. So I'm going to put the link here. If you go to this section here, the site that I just put in the chat, it'll take you directly to the coaches meeting content. You'll see the slides for today are posted. And then when I have the video downloaded and converted, I'll have a row for that in there, and it'll say recording or video. Right. So I want to thank you all for your time. We're doing this again next week. So if I see you next week, that would be great. Have a great one. Thank you for joining. And I'll stay on for a few minutes for questions if anybody has them.
Hi, Jennifer. I have a quick question about dealing with equity in the classroom. So I have a student in 5th grade or a couple students in different classes who